Thanks for coming tonight. I'm Alex. I'm one of the editors of Triple Canopy. In case you don't know, we share the space with two other organizations, the light industry and the public school. You probably also know that tonight we have a conversation about anonymous and anonymity and online culture and related issues. I'd like to thank the people who have supported, or the corporations or people who have supported this event. The Brown Foundation Incorporated of Houston, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, and perhaps most of all, the New York Council for the Humanities. I should also say that the event tonight marks the publication of our first ebook, which is Here Comes Nobody, Essays on Anonymous 4chan and Other Internet Culture, which compiles David Auerbach and Gabriella Coleman's articles, which were originally published in the 15th issue of Triple Canopy. So David and Gabriella are going to talk a little bit about the articles they published with Triple Canopy and their other work, and then James Grimmelmann will grill them. I didn't mean to do that. So Gabriella Coleman is a professor at McGill, and her work examines the ethics of online collaboration in institutions, as well as the role of the law and digital media in sustaining various forms of political activism. Her first book, Coding Freedom: The Aesthetics and the Ethics of Hacking, is forthcoming from Princeton University. She's currently working on a book about anonymous and digital activism. She is the Wolf Chair in Scientific and Technological Literacy at McGill's Department of Art History and Communication Studies. And her article in Triple Canopy is called Our Weirdness is Free. David Auerbach is a writer and software engineer living in New York. His essays have been published in the Times Literary Supplement, N+1, The Quarterly Conversation, and The Millions, and he maintains an excellent blog about literature and technology and other things called Waggish. His article for Triple Canopy, which is two parts actually, and deals primarily with 4chan and the culture that emerged from online message boards, is called Anonymity as Culture. James Grimmelmann is an associate professor at New York Law School and a member of its Institute for Information Law and Policy. He studies how the law governing the creation and use of computer software affects individual freedom and the distribution of wealth and power in society. He writes about intellectual property, virtual worlds, search engines, online privacy, and other topics in computer and internet law. And he also blogs at the Laboratorium. And I think that's it. So after, I think we'll have a conversation for maybe 45 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from you. Thanks for coming out.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to Triple Canopy for having us here. And I think we'd like to start with David talking about his article and about the anonymity culture of 4chan and other message boards.
Thanks, James. And is this okay? Everyone can hear? Yeah.
I can hear.
It's what? It's not on? It's on. Okay. All right. So, yeah, thanks, James. Thanks, Gabriella, for coming down from Canada. And thanks to Triple Canopy, and especially Alexander and Sam for helping out with my article. And to all the people who financed tonight, whose names I can't remember that Alexander just read off. I'd like to start by talking about a canonical case of anonymous culture on the internet, which is 4chan.org, and talk about how it exemplifies some of the key features of participating in an anonymous online social world. 4chan originated in 2003 for the purpose of discussion, and frequently obsessive discussion, of Japanese anime, as well as the posting of fan art, some of it highly sexualized. The name was borrowed from Japan's similar anime forums named 2chan. The most significant of these feature of these forums was that they were image boards, which allowed users to upload pictures, see the pictures that others posted, download these images, Photoshop them, mutilate them, re-upload them, and so on. And this was the start of some of the meme generation that is so pervasive today. And I wanted to do a little poll that we talked about just to get a sense of how to pace things. How many people here have heard of Rickrolling? Could you just raise your hands? Great, okay. How many people have heard of TV tropes? Okay. How about 4chan? Yeah, before I said it. Okay, yeah. Okay, great. How about, how many people have heard of Boxy? Okay, so reasonably. How many people are familiar with or have actually seen Goatsy? Wow, okay, great, this is great. We have the cognoscenti with us tonight. And finally, how many people... I don't even want to know. And finally, for those who haven't read the article, how many people are familiar with swap.avi? Okay, very few. Okay, great. Well, well, anyway, so yeah, after beginning with anime, discussion soon spread on 4chan to a number of other topics, many of them hobbies attracting an obsessive following or fandom of their own. Video games, comics, guns, bodybuilding, cars, and almost inevitably pornography. There were also forums for social discussion, sometimes intensely personal anonymous discussion, and most notoriously the random forum B, which has been called the asshole of the internet. It specializes in shock tactics and calculatedly offensive and abusive images and discourse. If you aren't scared off by the profanity, pornography, racial epithets, and monstrously flared anuses, these things quickly become numbing to anyone who spends a good deal of time on B. And this tolerance of offense and shock creates a feeling of solidarity and exclusivity among the participants. 4chan has also become one of a number of prime meme-generating spaces on the web, where images and topics are taken up and commented on and changed and remixed at lightning speed. Things like lolcats and rickrolling and nyancat all have their origins in these forums. And since every thread on a 4chan board is open to anyone posting who happens to be looking at the thread at the time, you frequently have dozens or even hundreds of posts per minute. Conversation can switch topics, fork into multiple back and forths, or devolve into chaos. Combined with the ability to post images, this fervid tempo is what allows for this kind of creativity. The anonymity of the users obscures the differences between them, so that highbrow, lowbrow, elite, working class, the obscene, and even the sacred can all mix together. It also can create a mob mentality sometimes, which stems from the hive mind nature of the discourse. It occasionally lashes out into the real world, as when his teenage suicide became a mock euphemism for offing oneself, the term "an hero." It's not, however, total anarchy. The 4chan administrators, headed by the site founder Chris Poole, aka Moot, monitor it constantly. And there's also self-policing activity to cut off any dangerous activity that could get the site taken down by the feds. In practice, this equates to any presence of child pornography. Some of the most violent clashes in the community have been over child pornography, frequently when trolls from other forums invade and try to cause trouble in an attempt to get the site taken down. These invaders are repelled by the community out of both disgust and, more importantly, the fear of being silenced. These communities do self-police when there's sufficient incentive, even though pedophilia has become sort of a nonstop inside joke amongst the participants, exemplified by a self-documenting site, Encyclopedia Dramatica, with the pedia meant to be a reference to pedophilia. The 4chan anonymous culture, which I call a culture, emerged from an earlier set of subcultures that had a few common traits. These included computer geeks, science fiction fans, and otaku of other sorts. Otaku being a Japanese term for obsessive fandom, which used to be highly derogatory, although these days it seems to have lost some of that sting, at least in America. I've heard conflicting things about whether or not it's lost that stigma in Japan. But these subcultures had shared a few common traits. Alienation from the mainstream of the world, a tendency towards conversational frankness and disregard for social niceties, and most of all, a fondness for pranksterism. In the time I spent looking at these sites, I observed three main economies that drove them. First, the economy of suspicion, because anyone online anonymously may not be who they claim to be. Any personal details or stories provided are going to be questioned, particularly, for example, if you claim to be a woman. Despite females making up a substantial percentage of the participants, they're still treated as the ineffable other in many of these forums. Secondly, there's the economy of offense, which I described a bit earlier, which is purposely calculated to exclude outsiders and validate insiders through a barrage of material calculated to alienate, even though the participants know that it's just a joke. The quest to offend and the pressure not to be offended is incessant. Finally, there's the economy of unreality. The online anonymous world is a masquerade full of temporary role-playing and self-mythologizing, and loosened of the consequences and the potential damage to one's reputation that one would face in the real world. 4chan is full of discussion and participation in the fictional worlds of comics, anime, and science fiction. It's become a play space with its own measures of prestige and a collective sense of group achievement, leading to the self-documentation and self-mythologization you see on Encyclopedia Dramatica and elsewhere, as well as the ability to vote within a 4chan thread for it to be archived for posterity as an epic thread on Best of 4chan. It also sometimes leads to competitive, distasteful transgressions on an extreme level, such as the hour-long Brazilian scat porn video swap.avi, commissioned jointly by users of 4chan progenitor somethingawful.com. 4chan represents an extreme because there's no persistent identity even between posts made by a single person. However, there are other cul-de-sacs of anonymity all over the web, all defined by the rejection of Facebook, Google+, and Twitter's emphasis on tying one's online identity to a real-life identity. Even when there's a persistent username over time in these other anonymous spaces, people remain anonymous in that there's far less bleeding in from the real world. The participants do, however, extend their anonymous online personae into the real world, especially when their libertarian play space is threatened or just for the sake of lulz. And with that, I'm going to hand you over to the lulz expert, Gabriella Coleman.
Great, thanks for that. All right, well, first I want to thank everyone at Triple Canopy, both for the event as well as the process of writing the article. It was extremely enlivening and wonderful, so I can't recommend it enough. So I thought to start I would read two quotes from Nietzsche to kind of, in one case, set the mood, and in the other get the kind of spirit of the lulz out there. And they're two aphorisms, and I actually think aphorisms really fit quite well as a genre for anonymous, whether it's a culture or the kind of political wings, because there's a way in which there's obviously forms of cultural order and logics at play when it comes to anonymous, but it's always kind of bordering on the edge of chaos as well. And so it's very hard to write something very systematic, and in some ways the aphorism, which pushes against systematicity, captures that spirit. Okay, so the first quote is as follows. A subterranean man is at work, one who tunnels and mines and undermines. As though he perhaps desires this prolonged obscurity, desires to be incomprehensible, concealed, enigmatic, because he knows what he will thereby also acquire, his own morning, his own redemption, his own daybreak. Now, the second quote kind of captures the spirit of the lulz a little bit. And for those that don't know, lulz is a pluralization and bastardization of the more commonly known laugh out loud. It's a kind of rowdy, subversive spirit of pranking, which is very common in a culture and then was taken by the sort of political wings of Anonymous and wielded sort of for tactical purposes. So this is the quote. Maintaining cheerfulness in the midst of a gloomy task is no small feat. And yet what is needed more than cheerfulness? Nothing succeeds if prankishness has no part. Excess strength alone is the proof of strength. And why I like that so much is because when it comes to the sort of transformation, which I'll talk a little bit later about, from a culture to a kind of politicized sphere of anonymous, first of all, it was quite surprising how it happened, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But what was also remarkable was that spirit of prankishness, of subversion, of rowdiness, kind of was taken over into the political realm. And of course, it couldn't be used in a quite unadulterated way as it emerges in the places that David looks at. But it's still finessed very tactically at times. And it also is that kind of spirit of humor, of cheerfulness in the context of political organizing, which can be quite depressing. And I think that's one of the interesting parts. Now, let me just mention a few things about the political wings of Anonymous that I touch upon for the most part in the article. One of which has to do with that metamorphosis, what exactly happened, because it was extremely accidental. So that's one issue that's addressed in the article. The other one has to do with the transition from what is really anonymity in a kind of true sense, there's no persistent identity, to the political wings of Anonymous where it's now pseudo-anonymous, right? People have persistent nicknames, handles, people start to get to know each other. But two interesting things happen, one of which is there's still an extremely, extremely strong ethic of identity sublimation. And what does this mean? What this means is that you shouldn't try to garner fame or status publicly for the actions you do in the name of Anonymous. And it really is a very interesting living practice where people will write philosophical documents about it, or in instances where people reveal too much information about themselves or are seen to be fame whores, they become marginalized or punished or sidelined. And then, of course, there's certain instances, such as with the small hacker crews, lulzsec, antisec, who garnered so much attention and thus were quite controversial because of the way that they pushed against this ethic of identity sublimation. So that's another element that's explored in some detail in the article. And again, it's profound, present, and persistent, although it also fails at times. And those are really interesting moments. Something I've thought about quite a bit recently has to do with friendships, secrecy, and betrayal. One of the interesting things about Anonymous is that people actually do become quite close. You become quite close because you're working politically in the face of adversity, right? You work on technical problems, you spend all this time chatting with each other, so on and so forth. But especially for those participants who break the law, not everyone does, there's a lot of paranoia and fear in these networks because there can be informants. And just recently, what was only rumor proved out to be true when Sabu, who was a key hacker with the group Antisec, was revealed to be working for the FBI since at least the fall. And so there's a really interesting way in which tight bonds of friendship form, but there's always this culture of paranoia that is very, very common. And I'm just gonna read you or contrast two quotes that I like that really get at this. So Sabu tweeted one day, he said, "Don't trust your friends. They will bring you down if they have to." And it's really interesting that he even considers them friends, because if you can't trust your friends, they can't be friends. Now this is a quote from someone talking to me on Internet Relay Chat, who said, "The story of AnonOps, which was a very important network, could be told from the perspective of the friendships of the people running it." So it's really interesting to think about how it is that friendships form, but they're always under a state of kind of distress and duress. Finally, the last element of which that the article addresses and that I'm quite interested in has to do with the politics of Anonymous. Now, many different operations have happened under the guise of Anonymous, from protesting police brutality in Oakland to assisting Tunisian revolutionaries to supporting WikiLeaks, right? So there's no one sort of political mandate that is united by all of Anonymous. But I do think that given the reality of the state of surveillance and the surveillance states, which obviously has a long history, but there's something about, especially the last decade, in which it's quite alarming, the kind of depth and extent. And it entails everything from changes in laws like the Patriot Act to a privatized security apparatus to kind of corporate forms of bottom-up surveillance, right? It's just coming at all these different sides. Anonymous really enchants and compels for a very particular reason, which is that they symbolically enact the forms of anonymity and privacy that are really an endangered species. And then materially, some of their actions have really gone after a privatized security state. And so I'm quite interested in that political element of Anonymous, which I do think has as much to do with a particular moment we're in as it has to do with Anonymous. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, so one of the it seems to me that there are a lot of really fascinating tensions in Anonymous, and that in some sense this is a culture that's built on a series of oppositions. So one of them is you have these spaces that really don't have persistent identity, that the typical 4chan thread lives for a few minutes. And from this, both of you have described a process that involves a recognizable collective identity emerging. People feel a sense of collective, and even within the more identified anonymous groups, there's this sublimation of self and a sense of an overriding spirit of the collective. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about how this collective sense of presence and identity comes out of a space that's a constant turmoil and churn.
Well, what Gabriella said about anonymity versus pseudo-anonymity is a really good point, and I alluded to it briefly, that there are these two levels of total anonymity in which there's no persistent identity across moments of participation versus having some online handle that still can't be tied to a real life person. And it seems that in both the political arm and in sort of the cultural arm, you have this central amorphous mass of total anonymity by which can sort of form splinter offshoots like LulzSec or like Encyclopedia Dramatica, where there are more long-term participants and people are actually have reputations, but that the larger community can survive the destruction of any one of these splinter groups. And I think and both, in fact, have witnessed the destruction, as obviously with LulzSec on Gabriella's side and on my side when Sherrod DeGrippo, the founder of Encyclopedia Dramatica, took the site down, replaced it with a Know Your Meme clone called Oh Internet, and tried to make it palatable to the mainstream, resulting in a torrent of hatred, possibly unrivaled by anything short of Scientology, because I think that sense of inner betrayal of a group, I mean, if you look at any sort of betrayal of fraternities or any sort of inwardly facing cult-like group, these groups are always most hostile towards any internal betrayal, and for good reason.
So I think in the opening I've mentioned some of the elements, in the case of the political wings, people spend a heck of a lot of time on internet relay chat. And while it's not necessary to be there to participate, Anonymous, and again, the political wings, would look very different if internet relay chat did not exist. And it's just really such a great medium for basically, as its name designates, chatting. And it's very old school. And it's really an important place for both sustaining a sense of place. Whenever a server that has been up, an IRC server that's been up for a long time, vanishes, all of a sudden it feels like, a black hole had sucked part of Anonymous away, So this is really important, and it's important for two reasons. One of which is it's a very playful atmosphere on IRC, very carnivalesque. It's very good for lulls as well, right? So it's really good for bonds of sociality, but it's also a good place for organizing operations, right? So that's one element. The other one I'm just going to mention briefly, and I do think it's both important for certain elements of what you look at, but especially for the political wings, is what I call media affirmation, which is, just to give you a quick example, when Anonymous decided to protest the Church of Scientology, it was spurred on by this video of Tom Cruise that had been leaked. It was a ridiculous video where he was kind of praising the church. It was for the purposes of recruitment. A bunch of web publishers were threatened with lawsuits. 4chan, Anonymous from his world, trolled the fuck out of the Church of Scientology. And then they're like, hey, maybe we should, protest on the streets. And this was spurred by a video that was made for the lulls. They go to the streets. They have this amazing, amazing day of protest, right? And there's two things, one of which was just being together on the streets is very powerful, right? That alone. But that evening, the protests were covered in the news, locally, on CNN, Fox, and then Anonymous themselves made kind of home-brewed videos. And so very quickly, there was a kind of affirmation of themselves as a community, as their antics were represented in the news. And that was very important, or has been very important, for many of the political operations of Anonymous, is this media affirmation, which helps to constitute the collective.
Just to add to that, I think the presence of sort of a shared antagonist is also something that creates very close bonds. Then Scientology seemed to be almost tailor-made for this role because it represented so many things that the community as a whole despised, being authoritarian, being a cult, being religion, having lots of mindless, foolish sheep, taking legal action against, legally censorious action against their enemies. You couldn't think of the more perfect target for an amorphous community of this sort.
And of course, Scientology, this is not the first time they managed to tick off the internet as a collective. In the 1990s, they got into a series of fights essentially with all of Usenet. It had a very similar dynamic. This is, a group that saw itself as standing for what made the online world special and unique, being directly challenged by an organization that seemed to be their antithesis. And it's fascinating now that we would have thought the internet, or I would have thought the internet had grown so large and so diverse that it could no longer summon a coherent internet-wide response. And yet you have this group that comes from what some people would consider the deepest cesspit of the internet, first standing up to speak on behalf of the whole, and then becoming politicized in a way that connects through into the SOPA protests earlier this year, which are in fact the closest thing to an internet-wide political movement since the 1990s.
Actually, I had a question for you, James, on this, which is the SOPA protests were interesting this is the SOPA bill that was going to allow for all sorts of internet, Stop Online Privacy Act. To what extent was that movement driven sort of top-down by sites like Tumblr, Google, and other technology companies that were opposed to the legislation themselves?
So this is a great question about political movements. And to some extent, I don't think that these companies could have gotten large numbers of people to take political action just by telling them to do so. They did two things. One is they helped spread a message. And in this respect, the participation of Google putting a notice on its front page was just some advertising. But they also legitimated the protest in the eyes of establishment figures. They made a popular movement seem not just like a bunch of cranks, but a genuinely broad-based movement that couldn't be ignored. But I think that there was, without a lot of very genuine, bottom-up, organized work, it would have fizzled. Turning a bit, I really loved a phrase that you used in talking about the response to Scientology, which is torrent of hatred, which these groups, Anonymous, can unleash remarkable levels of both technical attacks and also just pure invective on targets. And you used in your article the wonderful phrase, the ethos of lulls, which seems frequently to revolve around finding the perfect lulls-worthy target and then finding whatever they're vulnerable to and piling on it ruthlessly, mercilessly. And I would love, obviously there are targets like internal traitors and the establishment figures like Scientology, but I'm also curious about how some of the other target selection happens in groups that are essentially swarms, how it is that they make a decision to go after somebody or something and then organize to do it.
So there's a couple ways to approach that. One of which, and here we'll get to the kind of political instantiations, and then maybe you can talk a little bit more of some of the trolling instantiations like Dusty the Cat, which is one of my favorite ones. But I do think when it comes to some of the big events with Anonymous, I kind of like to say that they've got their pulse on world events, and when there is something good to exploit, they will exploit it well. And so what this means is that in the case of something like the Church of Scientology, that Tom Cruise video was central. And it was central because in some ways it was received as the perfect instantiation of something lulzy, even though it wasn't made for the lulz, obviously, right? And then the fact that Scientology threatened websites with legal action was a way to get a lot of people involved. Wikileaks is another really good example. One of the fascinating things to me was for many years, I thought the political wings of Anonymous would be hemmed very closely to just protest against the Church of Scientology because it was such the perfect nemesis. So it had become politicized in a very narrow way. But basically, in the fall of 2010, we saw Anonymous kind of branching out, and it branched out because of the convergence of really interesting world events. So WikiLeaks releases the cables, right? The 220 diplomatic cables. And guess what everyone, at least in the Western world, and much of other parts of the world are talking about? WikiLeaks, right? It's this moment of kind of synchronicity, and then all of a sudden you have these services pull the plug, right? And so this was an opportune moment to kind of get in there. It was the same thing with Tunisia, and over again, they kind of exploit unpredictable world events and sort of get in there. But for all the kind of successes that happen with Anonymous, there's also a lot of failures as well, right? A lot of things don't gain traction. You also, again, need the media often to pick up really soon after because that generates quite a bit of momentum as well.
Yeah, I mean, as I was looking at it, there seemed to be two broad categories. One is that of an actual antagonist, someone that is perceived to be threatening them in some way. And in that case, that's going to generate a response almost in a guaranteed way, simply because if there's one thing that unites them, it's the protection of this space. But as far as picking targets at random, the targets that, innocent targets or targets that may be problematic but don't seem to have any particular attraction to them, like, I don't know, Boxy. I think that I really had to look at them on a case-by-case basis, and I don't think that, aside from some aesthetic gestalt of the beauty of how something just so perfectly embodies some type of current day obsession, I think it's a similar move to what you see on Twitter with hashtags, and like, why did what was the exact name of the Ryan Gosling meme? Hey Girl. It was just Hey Girl. It wasn't Hey Girl something. Why that versus the countless other things, I feel like there's not a real generalization that can be made, and that we really are looking something that is sort of chaotic in the technical sense of the world, in the technical sense of the word.
Which is what makes it kind of powerful in some ways. It becomes very hard to predict, and which it's one of the reasons why it makes those attacks so exciting at some level.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think the attention to the visual aspect of it is very strong. That you know, even though much of the participation is verbal, it is images or videos that I think generate some of these things, possibly because they can be distributed and consumed so quickly. And I think that also accounts for the fact that it's often girls or women who become the targets, and can result in them getting stalked or harassed in one form or another. I know the girl who made the Boxy videos pretty much disappeared completely for a couple of years before returning to sort of poke fun at herself as though she accepted it and now was behaving as one of the community, and I think was greeted rather positively as someone who could take it in the spirit of lulz. But I don't know to what extent she suffered sort of personal harassment or had to run like hell from it.
Also, another way of maybe thinking about it is that once the attacks unfold, there is a logic to them, and they're understandable, but they're not predictable. So, for example, when 4chan rose to save this cat, Dusty, who was being abused, someone had posted a video of him being abused, the cat, and they found the perpetrator, embarrassed the heck out of the 10-year-old or 13-year-old kid, right? And Anonymous was like, we love cats. We make lol cats. Of course we have to rise in defense of the cat. You know what I mean? And that there is a kind of logical connection there. And I do think with a lot of the attacks, there is some sort of logical connection, but again, it's not predictable beforehand at some level.
And I mean, if you have a splinter group form, their targets become much more predictable. I'm thinking of the group that actually, the vigilante group that actually sets traps for pedophiles and tries to lure them into actually setting up meetings with underage girls and then calls law enforcement. What is the name of it?
I'm not sure.
The name of this? They claim to, sorry?
Perverted justice.
Perverted justice. They claim to have caught something like 200 at this point. And I mean, as with any of this, it's hard to know, but it sounds like Sam finds this extraordinarily funny. I'm not sure why. But it's hard to know how seriously to take it, but it seems like this is something that they're actually doing. But again, I think you only get that level of consistency and effort when you have a splinter group, often with a very strong personality. And I know that the guy who heads up Perverted Justice is a very, very strong personality, and that other people in the community, in the larger community, have had fallouts with him.
Let me ask one more question of the two of you, which is thinking about what seems like there's a really strong, called revulsion/fascination dynamic going on in a lot of A culture and in a lot of the self-definition of Anonymous. There's this, you talked about the carnival atmosphere of the protests, but it certainly also characterizes their online activity too. There's a desire, I think, to see how far something can be pushed to the point at which it becomes disgusting or awful, and then to claim at once to be horrified by the results and also fascinated by it. There's that wonderful picture illustrating your piece of the cat, the lol cat, what is seen cannot be unseen. This cat with an expression of just utter shock and horror, and that's meant to be the reaction video of somebody seeing one of the shock videos for the first time. And I'm interested in this dynamic of playing with the transgressive, the obsessive with pedophilia. There's something interesting going on here.
I think that, it certainly predates the internet, the fashion with the grotesque and grand guignol. I think that it's easy. The presence of the internet makes it much easier for it to become competitive. That now you can't rest with just, oh, I've seen this gross thing and so I'm cool now, because someone else is going to tell you, well, you've seen that? That's nothing. I've seen this. It's like, oh, you've seen that? I commissioned this 60-minute video. And I mean, slop.avi is, for those who are not in the know, is indeed a 60-minute scat porn video commissioned by a Something Awful user that actually did get called the worst thing ever on the internet. There was some sense that this was as far as it could possibly go. And of course, it's as far as it can possibly go within limits. There's some sense of, okay, you aren't going to murder anyone in the same way that, you know, all known snuff videos are apparently fakes, except for those that use footage. But there are not, apparently no one's ever tracked down a snuff video of people actually killing someone and then putting it on film expressly for that purpose. And I think that there is this sense, well, I guess, I talked to a 7-year-old, and she gave me this wonderful dichotomy, because she was talking about how she wanted to get candy because her mom was not around so they could be bad. And I would say, you like being bad? And she said, yeah. And I said, so are you going to murder someone? And she said, no. And I said, that's bad. She said, no, it's not. That's evil. So I think there's always there's the remaining sense between what is bad and what is actually, you know, beyond the pale of the collective mindset. And so within that boundary, I think people are struggling, and there's this pride of sort of having the secret knowledge that I think I compared it to H.P. Lovecraft and other sorts of Gnosticism, where yes, you've been exposed to horrors that will forever pollute your view of the world, but you know, you still are tapped into something that no one else is, and that sort of elitism. And I mean, it's outright elitism. I mean, on some level, these people are not just thinking that they're different from the rest of the world, but they think that they have some element of humanity, sensitivity, authenticity that the rest of the world lacks, that the normal fags or norps, normal, ordinary, that these people are just, in fact, simulacra next to, you know, what's real.
And yet, what's so interesting too, because you highlight the kind of agonistic, competitive, elitist qualities, which are absolutely there. And yet, if you look at the sheer numbers of participants, it really is a kind of open sphere populace where, you know, there's always been traditions of transgressions. But I don't think, you know, there is something about the technology and the sheer number of kind of geeks and hackers in the world, which does make it a slightly populist sphere, where there's really large numbers, which then fuels the kind of competitiveness, because there's just so many different participants. And then the sheer number of, you know, images and catchphrases, humor that are, you know, produced, it's really hard to stand out, you know. And so you really have to push to the extreme, both in terms of grotesqueness and humor, to get attention. So that's kind of another quality. Then there's the whole like free speech issue, you know. Definitely when it comes, again, to individuals, when you talk to them, or some trolling associations, like the Gay Niggers Association of America, which is a very kind of offensive trolling group. Its president, Weave, has really strong free speech arguments about why he does what he does. And so there's a weird sort of way where this world of transgression and tricksterism meets kind of liberal, libertarian, free speech extremism as well. And they kind of perform their kind of desire to be extreme with language as a way to saying, we're never going to give in with language. It's so important to have no barriers or borders. And then some participants I speak to do see the internet as a kind of safe space of sorts, where the normal rules don't apply. And not only do they not apply, the rule is to break the rule at some level.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, there definitely, if you know, the bar to membership is either low or high, depending. I mean, anyone can become a member of this group if they're willing to put up with the shock and abuse, and I guess take it under advisement that it's not, that on some level it's not meant, even though it occasionally is. But one of my favorite bits was a conversation. I think this might have been on IRC, where some people were talking about a discussion they had with over IRC with a foreigner somewhere, and realizing that they were actually anti-Semitic or actually racist, and they were just saying, like, how can this be? Oh my God, this person like really thought that like Jews controlled the world. And if you look at this just at first blush, it would seem ridiculous, because if you go to Encyclopedia Dramatica, you'll see every anti-Semitic, anti-Black, anti-Hispanic, anti-anything slur in the world. But the fact that anyone would actually take a lot of this stuff seriously comes as almost impossible, because the world is hermetically sealed in that way, and it entertains certain beliefs, and there are limits to what's believed. If you go in there with a religious fundamentalist attitude, you are not going to be welcomed. I mean, you may be vaguely tolerated, but you are definitely going to get piled on.
This seems like a good time to open it out and have you join in the conversation. I should point out that we are being recorded, so this is going to pick up the back of your head. If you'd like to retain further anonymity, you should try to disguise your voice. Okay, yeah.
So when we were editing this article, it was kind of late last year, and sort of a lot of the editing was just sort of pushing you to make connections to things that were going, WikiLeaks stuff, Occupy stuff. But what occurs to me now, just is that there's this other aspect we didn't really think about, which is this other tech culture with an elitism, a kind of sense of being in opposition, yet a total dominance, which is kind of like Silicon Valley startup culture. And you're talking about Paul Graham or Peter Thiel or Mark Andreessen and their kind of elitism and their libertarianism versus what may or may not be anarchism in these cultures. And I wonder whether they ever, they're hackers in both places, whether they ever kind of look back at this place that's making a ton of money yet still somehow thinks of itself as the underground, and how that whether that ever actually plays out, or whether they can't. That's like a mirror that they can't look in or something.
I would say, well, having been in that world myself for a time, I would say that there's uneasy connections, and that they do remain somewhat separate. And one example would be, one extreme example would be Richard Stallman, who is the founder of the Free Software Foundation and GNU, and has contributed immensely to the open source movement. And I fear here that I may be attributing to him the wrong position or organization. I hope that GNU is his preferred association, but he is dyed in the wool, I think, sort of idealist, communalist, anti-capitalist thinker, and his patience for any sort of capitalist indulgent in these matters is sub-zero. Not everyone is as extreme as him, and I think that applies in anonymous circles as well. But there is this sense that while there is a shared ethos, and I think it's like saying that all these people also share an ethos with objectivists and followers of Ayn Rand. And there are many followers of Ayn Rand, both in a culture, probably in anonymous, I'm guessing, despite a more prevalent anarchist or collectivist mindset, and in the tech world proper. But even having a vaguely libertarian ideology still makes for great cleavages over practical implementation. And I wanted to ask Gabriella about this, because even in my knowledge of the political arms of Anonymous, there does seem to be a side that is more anarcho-libertarian or even anarcho-capitalist, and then a side that is closer to, I guess, the Workers of the World Daily, more Marxist collectivist party. And David Graeber has actually talked about those two sides within the Occupy movement too, and how there have been tensions there, him being on the anarchist side.
Well, briefly, I study computer hackers, and I don't know, I feel like a broken record often when it comes to representations of hackers, because it's often the case that people are like, oh, hackers are all libertarian and want to live in Silicon Valley and make a lot of money. And like, no, 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 no. I mean, one of the interesting things about computer hackers is that there's different traditions at play. And it's everything from the kind of tradition of free software and open source, which has parts which are very comfortable with Silicon Valley, others which are not. There's a transgressive tradition whose roots lie in phone phreaking, which always had the kind of spirit of pranking in the lulls, which kind of fed into trolling, which was also important for Anonymous. There's a kind of tradition of encryption. And there are these great cleavages. And I actually think with at least the trolling groups, it's a little bit hard to say blanket statements about 4chan because of the nature of what it is, right? But I do know some trolling associations see themselves as the seedy underbelly of the kind of tech world and hate Silicon Valley, you know? And some individuals have no money, they do drugs, they troll, they're marginalized, you know? And they do have this kind of other. Now, there are some trolls who are probably in the heart of Silicon Valley as well, right? And then this gets to the composition of Anonymous in terms of like, who are these people and what are their politics? And one of the fascinating sort of things about Anonymous is that even though they're not anonymous, but pseudo-anonymous, you're not expected to carry a political card of any sort. And because of that, the kind of collection of people is quite diverse in terms of their individual politics. It is always from liberal to left. You don't have a lot of people who are right. But within that mix, you have everything from anti-capitalist anarchists of the David Graeberian sense. You have libertarians in the kind of American sense. You have social democrats. You have people who are part of the 1%. You have people who are from, you know, the hood. And in fact, I do think that there is something about the kind of pseudo-anonymity of it that allows for a greater diversity than what you have with kind of traditional groups where you show your kind of face, your status, your class, right? And with that out of the way, it produces or it allows for greater diversity. What unites them is a kind of commitment to free speech at some level. You know, that is the bread and butter. That's what kind of everyone can sort of agree on. But aside from that, you know, it's really quite diverse in terms of their own individual political makeup.
And let me just add that one sense of what makes them distinctive is that there's a shared identity built around the internet. And to the extent that that is culturally and in terms of their community sense, what is uniting? In fact, the categories of how they approach politics in the offline world are secondary. So that precisely the reason that these political categories aren't primary in defining their orientation towards the internet and each other. More questions? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, you were just talking about how important free speech is to Anonymous, but the Pirate Party in Europe recently criticized elements within Anonymous for censorship. They equated DDoS attacks, which is their primary tool, with censorship. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that and also maybe more broadly the ethics of DDoS attacks.
So, you know, one thing actually I will say about hackers is that they're quite opinionated and sectarian, right? And free speech is vague enough at some level that you can have big differences as to what it means. And so what you refer to precisely is that sectarianism at some level. So you have everything from individuals like Richard Stallman, who is not part of a transgressive tradition, who came out in support of Anonymous when they had DDoS, MasterCard, and PayPal, to then other very famous hackers who are just like, that is child play, that is not, you know, technically elite enough, to the Pirate Party. From the very start, like a few years ago, they were very critical, saying you're censoring because you're taking a website down. And so that positionality, I think, is a reflection of both the kind of ambiguity of free speech and the sectarianism within the world of hacking. Now, I've thought a lot about what, you know, the distributed denial of service attack is. I've thought about it for years. And I do think that it can be quite ineffective over time because it is a form of kind of spectacle that requires the media to report on it. And so you're really beholden to them, and so it could lose its effectiveness over time. However, I do think, especially since a number of people are facing trial over the DDoS attacks, it is really important to convey what happens, which is not only is there no damage, but basically website is bombarded with too many requests, and so then it has to be kind of taken down or it crashes. One of the important things is that all the kind of sites that have been attacked are kind of business card style sites, which is kind of information where there's no either critical infrastructure behind it or there's no financial transactions being performed on these websites. So it really is a symbol of the infrastructure, not the actual infrastructure. And that's just important to convey because the companies that are, have been targets are sort of blowing up the kind of rhetoric in terms of the losses and the damage. It's embarrassing. It does cost some sort of money and resources, but nothing in terms of critical infrastructure is taken down. And again, websites that do any heavy processing of finances or data are like super fortified and are extremely, extremely hard to take down. So I see it as a kind of political stunt, which has its benefits and downsides.
Yeah, I'm pretty much with Gabriella on that. I think that as with music and video piracy, the penalties are so draconian that I feel it's a little irresponsible to speak out against it in a politicized way, simply because enough establishment forces are already coming down so hard on these people. The trial of the 20 DDoS people. Do you know what state is? What is that? That trial has not started yet, but I mean, it looks like they could be facing some fairly harsh penalties for things that did considerably less damage than, say, a number of financial transactions made by people at Goldman Sachs. But I guess that's easy to say. So, and the Pirate Party in particular is an interesting case because, unlike other political wings, they are in effect participating in the establishment. They have been accepted into the establishment, and that inherently creates an incredible tension between them and the rest of the community that does not have to sort of watch what they say and bear some, no matter how small, responsibility for the governing policy of the EU, at least, where they have seats right now. I don't think they have seats in Sweden yet.
Yeah. Nina.
So I read about the group of Chinese vigilantes that I guess is translated into English as Demon Flesh Search Engine, and I was wondering if you guys could speak to how the anonymous cultures you're studying sort of alter or are transformed in non-Western or at least non-Anglophone countries.
Well, I was at a panel at RuffleCon where there was a speaker who was talking about Chinese memes and memes that became very political. And, and I'm no expert, but all I just want to convey is that it can thrive quite well in those contexts. And there's something about the very kind of nature of language, right, which is very hackable at some level, which has made it very fecund for the type of sort of politicization of memes. And the same has happened in Brazil as well. And also when it comes to Anonymous, the political wings, there is an extremely active regional network in Brazil. And I credit it to both the sort of embrace of 4chan there, it's very popular, as well as the fact that there is a deep tech sector in Brazil, so that there's many kind of geeks and hackers who hold those kind of skills, capacities, and cultural sympathies that then make it sensible for them to kind of jump on to this world of Anonymous. And then, of course, there's very particular inflections that grow because of the local place, but they do kind of adopt some of the more global dimensions as well.
Yeah, in a bizarre side note, Google's early social network, Orkut, became huge in Brazil and I believe nowhere else. And I actually don't have an explanation for this, but I think it actually served as something of a conduit as well. I think the classic example, although it's not in China, it was in Korea, I believe, South Korea, of a woman whose dog pooped in a subway or on a bus, and the video was posted to the internet, and this woman was really persecuted. Apparently she got death threats and had to go into hiding. So there is this danger of an utterly disproportionate reaction. I don't know. I mean, it sounds like it's frequent enough in China. I don't know in Korea that it merits study, but not knowing Chinese and not knowing Chinese culture, I really can't speak to the frequency of it or how, what I assume to be obvious cultural differences affect the differing rules, implicit rules that people take when they do this.
Apparently, because censorship is real in China, like a lot of the memes that get created have to evade filters, and so there's a lot of kind of clever wordplay that happens with a lot of the kind of memes that get created there.
Do we have a picture of the llama?
The grass mud horse.
The grass mud.
Yeah.
Well, so grass mud horse, apparently, in Chinese, the characters are very similar to the characters for "Fuck You Chinese Party Central Committee," and so I'm not making this up. And so consequently, this llama grass mud horse type thing has become the emblem of anti-censorship in China.
And there's like a song.
And the Chinese government has actually mandated that it be referred to by a different word that does not have that second association. And I believe it has to do with aspects of the characters. I don't know enough about Chinese.
It's only a difference in tone.
Yeah.
And the three-watch crab.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the artist Ai Weiwei had what got him in trouble was a series of nude. If you search for Ai Weiwei, yeah, there we go.
That became a huge meme.
He got put in jail for this. I believe this was the trigger that led him getting arrested. This and a scene he did, I think, with 2 or 3 nude women or groupies or type thing, also with llamas, and it seemed both as sort of nudity, but also as an immense political statement. Him basically flipping the finger to the Chinese government, and on, I believe, Twitter. Many Chinese people started posting nude photos of themselves with their genitals covered up by a llama / grass mud horse in solidarity with him. So, I mean, I think that these things, when you are looking at, I mean, you saw these things in communist Russia as well, where symbolism is deployed, and in a situation where speech is much more watched, as Gabriella says, there is you get this ability to create symbols that have a cultural cachet.
Maybe one thing I would add about the human flesh search engine phenomenon, which there are also examples even today, still from Korea. There's an article in the latest Wired about one. They tend to have a more community norm enforcement character. It's less the internet versus some offline target, and more going after somebody who has done something offline that transgresses norms. Letting your dog poop on the subway and not cleaning up after it, or deserting your wife, is some of the classic Chinese human flesh search engine examples. So it has a different inflection.
So would you say that, I mean, this is a case in which violation of law is less important than violation of sort of implicit community moral norms that might be more tolerated in a more libertarian mindset?
although the high-speed rail accident with the train, you know, that had happened in China recently, and the government was like, you know, try to cover up what had happened, there was a huge response from the internet to kind of both uncover what happened, and then there was these amazing, amazing memes that were playing off the trains with, you know, great phrases that were full of lulls. I mean, they were like really hilarious. That kind of is in the style of what would happen, you know, in the West as well.
Okay. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that these sort of politically correct views are espoused as sort of just a joke and an exercise of free speech. But the anons on 4chan, the sort of like default identity is the straight white male. And anyone who dares to like self-identify outside of that is sort of like insulted and harassed as to sort of dissuade anyone from identifying outside of that. And I was wondering if you could speak to that seeming contradiction.
Yeah, well, I want to draw a slightly finer line. I think that white and male are true, straight less so. I think there's actually quite a tolerance of deviant sexuality and quite an exploration of it. Partly this comes in from the influx of the influx of Japanese anime and the fandom, which, I mean, there are entire genres of Japanese anime devoted to homosexuality, cross-dressing, transgenderism, and the idea of the so-called trap, which is the male that looks like a female, and so you don't realize that it's a female until it's quote-unquote too late. But nonetheless, what I saw is that I mean, in the same way that homosexuality, bisexuality is a cross-class and cross-race issue, that I think allows it to sort of achieve more acceptance and be more present in a way that issues of race and gender don't. I think the difference between male and female is very, very significant. I think you have lots of participants that are not going to admit that they are women. You have lots of participants, and anyone who does admit it is immediately treated differently, I think. And to that contradiction, I can say that I think it really is an extension of gender roles in our society that, you know, for all the last 30 years may have created academic work that is more anti-essentialist when it comes to gender. If anything, I think, you know, feminism has engaged more with at least the presence feminism, progressive politics has engaged more with sort of the idea of play with anti-essential gender roles. And so I think that because as long as the dominant demographic on 4chan at least consists of that will persist, simply because it's difficult to address in a systematic way, and that the larger culture would have to change before it reflects it on 4chan. I think you would find any number of biases and, you know, received assumptions coming into 4chan. I don't think that has to conflict with the ethos we're describing, but at the same time, I mean, yeah, you can't pretend they aren't there. If you go, however, to if you go, for example, to LiveJournal, which I see as forming some aspect of a culture, certainly more than a lot of other, what?
Urban Baby.
No, Urban Baby. Well, okay, maybe so. Yeah, Urban Baby is a site where people anonymously complain about all the issues of parenthood, and if you want to see what Park Slope parents are really like, it's your worst nightmare. So yeah, I guess so. And there you will find you will find very different cultures and their assumptions that aren't building in this. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Sort of.
Do you want to follow up?
Yeah, you know a lot about it.
Well, I feel like it's a big subject, and I just wanted to hear your sort of initial thoughts on it. So I will change my answer to yes.
Okay, I certainly agree with what you're saying, with the caveat that I think the sexuality is more open. Gabriella, do you want?
I can leave it at that.
Oh, sorry.
Hey, yeah, there, back.
I'm just curious about, I feel like there's always a lot of negative talk about Anonymous and about what comes along with the effects of having an anonymous culture online. Like, you can bully people and they don't know, and so people feel like they can get away with stuff. Or like, people gang up together and do the terrible things. 4chan is a cesspit. But then when things like, I forget which Korea it was, I'm just going to say West Korea, said that they were going to institute a forced naming policy on their internet, that like you would have to identify on the internet as your real name, you would be able to post anonymously, or that there was some legislation that came to Albany today, I think, saying that anonymous posting on the internet in New York State at least would be against the law. We very quickly say, well, that is ridiculous and that is bad and we shouldn't allow that. So I believe you guys can talk about maybe like what are the positive aspects of anonymity online? Is it a good thing? Do you think that it is bad if we were to get rid of it?
I definitely think it would be bad.
You get all kinds of views. A named chair, who I will not name, from a highly prestigious law school, who holds a PhD in philosophy, gave a talk at my law school at one point, which he argued that there was no morally convincing reason to extend any protection to anonymous speech of the sort of harassing type that's the bread and butter of places like 4chan. He hadn't actually heard of 4chan, although he was critiquing it. He said there's no First Amendment protection there whatsoever. And you can certainly point to serious harms that flow from it. From the de-individuation, from the group dynamics, and from the possibility of harassment without fear of detection. So people sending anonymous bomb threats to the University of Pittsburgh managed to cause a series of highly disruptive evacuations for weeks this spring. And there are very readily traceable costs. But if you don't have the culture of anonymity, even in its most carnival-esque atmosphere, you also don't get the succession of memes and the cultural outflow that David mentioned at the start of his presentation in the survey group here. And you don't get the remarkable personal expression, possibility of WikiLeaks-style political dissent. You have an enormous range of things that you just lose. And I think those are culturally and democratically crucial. What we have right now is a kind of ad hoc compromise in which we have identifiability some of the time for some purposes at some costs. And it's not a principled compromise. It's just where the law has come to rest on a bunch of axes. But it's actually really important that it preserves spaces that can function with low identifiability. Front row? Yeah.
Just to follow up with what you're saying. So isn't supporting WikiLeaks in a sense at odds with this culture of anonymity? Like there's complete transparency versus anonymity. I just wonder how do they sort of reconcile these like seemingly.
Oh, because Julian Assange was a kind of fame whore and drew a lot of attention to himself. Like how do you?
No, I mean that Anonymous seemingly supports WikiLeaks, which is whose ideals are for like complete and total transparency. So I just wonder like where does that like at what point do you stop being transparent and start supporting complete transparency?
I mean, I think WikiLeaks and I think a lot of people anonymous would agree that they want transparency from states and corporations, but want to preserve spaces both for cultural and political reasons where you don't have the intrusion of the state or corporations, and they'll, differentiate. That doesn't mean that there's not some contradictions going on. I mean, WikiLeaks was very, intransparent in many ways. Some individuals within Anonymous dox individuals, which is, release their social security numbers, right? There are definitely contradictory practices within these realms, but I do think that they rightfully parcel out the difference between certain private spaces, certain public spaces. I will say, though, it's interesting. I was reading a book by a lawyer, Danielle Citron, who works on harassment against women, often through these anonymous channels, right? And it's been really, difficult to kind of read her work because after reading it, I'm so horrified by many of the cases that she is addressing. And, I'm actually interested in hearing James' his thoughts about this, but I differentiate, and I don't know if it's just kind of a silly line to draw, between kind of persistent harassments, where, if there's one individual or a couple or one board that's targeting one individual for months and months and months, I do feel like it's okay to find legal recourse against that at some level, but to outlaw spaces of anonymity, to always default to IP addresses, to require logs, I find extremely problematic.
I guess the analogy I would draw is to, in some ways to the schoolyard, that, there is such tacit acceptance of all sorts of bullying and mistreatment amongst kids. And yet, we do not, most, in general, our culture today does not crack down on that because the degree of surveillance and supervision required to actually police kids would entail taking away what we believe to be an important part of aspect of their freedom. And I don't think it's an either-or situation, but I think that one can, again, as Gabriella was saying, draw the line between someone acting in a public capacity and transparency and someone acting in a more private capacity. Those two areas can bleed together, and I think that I would say that the culture, because of its sort of us versus them antagonistic mindset towards ordinary reality, perhaps finds it too easy to say, well, we want complete transparency from them, and we want complete anonymity and privacy for us. And that's not sustainable, but I do think that a pragmatic compromise is possible.
I guess the way that I think about this is that the exercise of power, wherever it's found, increasingly tends to undercut one's case for anonymity. So this can be political power conferred and used by the state, and that to the extent people are empowered to act in ways that today involve killing people, these are decisions that, as a democracy, really need to be subject to public scrutiny. And so the decisions made by the state, there's a very strong, very obvious case for transparency there. And this is where I think Danielle's perspective comes in very enlightening, which is that to the extent people acting with anonymity can send harassing messages, can send death threats, can make people live physically in fear for themselves because their addresses have been posted on the internet and people are posting photos of their children. That is a kind of power, and that undercuts their case to act with anonymity. People who are conversing among themselves and building communities, who are not imposing their will on others, their case for being left alone to not be identified is much stronger in that respect. I don't know quite how we sort out all of these in an actual legal and technical system, but I think that that's how I mediate the tension you describe.
Well, I think, and to some extent, I think you are relying on a certain moral sensus communis, that most of the people are going to be good actors, that most of them will be bad but not evil. Because people would be killing each other in this room right now if that sensus communis did not exist, or 4chan would cause way more damage than what we've seen so far. So I think it's really a question of where you set the line of tolerance, knowing that there will be quasi-legal activities, and for example, child pornography. I don't see anyone campaigning to, make child pornography legal or the images of child pornography legal. That seems to be an accepted limit, even though it would, in the absolute abstract, conflict with freedom of expression.
Let me just help with our hosts how we're doing on time. I'd love to take a few more questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, great. In the front.
So the distinction you drew, if I understand it well, is between anonymity as a form of expression and anonymity oriented to action, right? So there is an anonymity, a self-expression that even, the letters to the editor of a newspaper, right, that are published anonymously, nobody would deny that right. And then there is an anonymity that you use oriented to action, say the Pittsburgh University bomb threats, which is an entirely different thing. But I would claim that Anonymous as a political movement is neither of these two cases. It's actually, I call it a collective pseudonym or an improper name, that is to say, an act of appropriation of a tag that is used in 4chan to mark and sign comments, so that it becomes a subjective collective wheel through which a trace of an action is left anyway. So to make an example, the hack of the Sony PlayStation network, you have a DDoS on Sony that is called by Anonymous. And then there is the actual hacking of the network that is performed by someone anonymous that we don't know who this person or collective is. So in one case, the action is called for by Anonymous with a capital A, an organized group that uses this collective pseudonym. In another case, an action follows a few weeks later by an individual or the groups of individuals that do not leave any trace of what they've done. So you have here a third layer that is neither anonymity for self-expression nor anonymity oriented to action, but is an anonymity that is oriented to a collective action that claims something, but not as an individual, right? So I think that this also ties back to what you were saying before when you say that this culture can survive as an anonymous culture in spite of its pseudonymous offshoots and splinter groups, right? So I was wondering whether we can trace a further distinction here between this kind of broadening culture of like expressing yourself on a daily basis just using the tag anonymous says, and then this other intermediate layer in which people start appropriating that tag for committing actions, but executing actions, but not as individuals, which is not entirely anonymous either.
Of course, my distinction breaks down in both directions. You have expression that is oriented as a call to action, and you have actions that have symbolic meaning. So, of course, my distinction's incoherent when you poke at it enough.
The question was for the three.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I don't think I'm going to do a great job at answering this, but I'm struggling with this a lot because on the one hand, and your work has been really influential for my thinking about Anonymous because it is this multiple use name, right? Which is, different people can take the name and different groups have, right? And yet there is similar kind of iconography, aesthetics, and ethics that travel across. But it muddies things a lot, right? Which is one of its political powers. And yet things stabilize as well, in terms of groups of people who work together. There is a kind of sociology that you can get at to some degree, but it's an unstable sociology, a constantly shifting sociology because of the dynamics you're talking about. So it's a little bit betwixt and between, always in transition, always kind of moving, but not totally chaotic or disordered either.
Yeah, I mean, the larger collective amorphous group will always dwarf the more well-defined splinter groups. And I mean, a lot of the splinter groups just won't last that long. I mean, the political ones, especially like LulzSec, burnt out really quickly. But even those that do last, still seem to be immediately distinguished from that larger group because there are higher barriers to entry. Because the people are well defined by a pseudo-anonymous handle, there's much more of a sense of being a newcomer to it. And so one can't join in quite the same way. But being a member of the larger collective, which has a very low bar to entry as long as you can put up with it, sort of allows you to participate in the formation of those splinter groups as they're created. And I think that's as far as I don't know if I can say anything more other than that those two levels have a complex interaction.
Also, I think when it comes to anonymous operations, groups have no trouble kind of with attribution, except when things are illegal. And then when they're illegal, it's in their kind of interest to really muddy the waters quite a bit. Which means that in a lot of the hacking operations, what is claimed to be done by X person or by anonymous, in some cases it is, in some cases it's not. And it's totally in their interest to just keep those waters as muddy as possible because the risks are so kind of great when it comes to the hacking operations.
Although, even in legal matters, I think there is a sense that you don't brag. If prestige is going to accumulate to your moniker, it's going to be by community acclamation.
Lulsec, not, Sabu who did it, not this person who did it, the group. Yeah, that's true.
So I think this brings us to the end of our time. Please join me in thanking David and Biella.
And thanks to James for moderating.